Well, it's been almost a full year since Steve Wilson put out Personal Shopper as like a single to promote his newest album of The Future Bites, which then got postponed. And yeah, was it really worth the wait? The Future Bites by Steven Wilson. So, does Steven Wilson even really need an introduction at this point? And it's interesting. As I sat down to film this, something came to my mind in that Steven Wilson's always either been labeled or talked about through what he isn't, and it was always like he isn't a big pop star. He doesn't like to think of himself as a progressive rock artist or a prog artist. He doesn't want this being labeled on him. He doesn't want that labeled on him. At the end of the day, as much as he might not like to admit it or have this label be put onto him, he is the face of modern progressive rock music or modern prog. He's arguably the most popular and the most well-known recording artists in the prog sphere at the moment. I mean, he was the lead frontman of Porcupine Tree. He was in dozens of other projects such as No Man, Blackfield, Base Communion, Storm Corrosion. Those are just four that I've listed off the top of my head. He had lots of other ones. And then his production work and mixing and remastering of classic albums is paramount. Like he's gone through and he's remastered like most of Jethro Tull, Yes, and Gentle Giant. So the man is a giant force when it comes to the prog sphere. But within his own personal career, in terms of like the Steven Wilson, once he kind of broke off with a lot of the side projects, most notable the Porcupine Tree one, it was a little bit of an interesting career, and one that I've been really enjoying and really interested in following. His first two albums of Insurgents and Grace for Drowning were really great dark art rock in that sense. I love both of those albums. And then he went full on prog with his Hand Cannot Erase and The Raven That Refused to Sing albums. And then he came out with To the Bone, which was the last studio album before The Future Bites, which was his attempt of going more pop, of going more accessible, and he even went on the record to say bands like ABBA are great. It's so hard to write catchy and popular tunes and music. So this is his foray, his little toe dipping into that. And I think the biggest issue that I have with The Future Bites, which still is my least favorite project from him, is that it didn't feel as committal as I felt like it really should have been. At the end of the day, it's just not catchy. Like, that's one thing that pop music and popular expressions of music needs to have, is it needs to be catchy. It needs to be immediately accessible. And in terms of the personnel that we find on this, like most of Steven Wilson's solo career stuff has had kind of a revolving door in terms of personnel. Most of the people from To the Bone are still found on here. Nick Briggs being the bass player on here. I mean, he's been with Steven pretty much since the beginning, and he's a staple member at this point. I can't really see Nick leaving at this point. But we also have Nanette Taibib? I think that's it. She was also on not only To the Bone, but also a little bit with Hand Cannot Erase. So I'm glad to see that she is still found on here a little bit with some of the backing vocals. And we still also have that same drummer of Craig Blundell providing the drums. I mean, he had to fill a massive pair of shoes when Menemin left after Hand Cannot Erase, but I think he fits the bill a little bit more on this particular expression. I can't honestly see Marco playing on this album. I can't picture it. And we have a new guy coming in terms of the keyboards, which is Adam Holtzman. I can't honestly recall if Adam's been playing with Steven at this point, but he rounds out the band, and he kind of cut a lot of other personnel that he had listed on To the Bone, because To the Bone had quite a number of other musicians. So it's interesting that To the Bone is the one that's more packed full of musicians. That's a whole lot of preamble to get us to The Future Bites. And I mean, we even have a little bit more because this was set to be released last year. And because of, COVID and he couldn't tour it, he decided to postpone the release of this to this year, which, in my honest opinion, I think was a mistake. I do think that he should have released it on schedule, because a lot of bands still did that and found quite a bit of success through releasing their albums in that climate. And I mean, the climate that we find ourselves in, honestly, isn't all that better. He still can't tour this album. He still can't promote it the way that he could have 2 years ago. So the fact that he postponed this album as much as he did only served to have it out of our hands for a full year. Now that we have it in our hands, and now that we can actually listen to it, what do we actually have? Like, this is kind of the meat and potatoes of this video. What do we actually have in our hands with the Future Bites? Well, it does continue the trend that was set with the To The Bone session, in that it's much more accessible. It's a lot more pop infused. I will start this whole off. I mean, I've already talked for a lot of time, but I will start by saying that I enjoyed this album a hell of a lot more than I enjoyed To The Bone. I think this album succeeds where To The Bone fails. It is immediately accessible, it is immediately catchy, and it immediately grabbed my attention. Through the first 4 to 5 listens of this album, I found myself grooving along to it. I found myself connected to this album, which I didn't feel myself with To The Bone. And I found myself really digging and grooving along with a lot of these tracks. They're very fun. Now, the Future Bites has a lot of different concepts on it that kind of can be whittled down to that old meme that is, we live in a society. It's the age-old, very basic take of society sucks, but how can you criticize society when you live in a society? And they play a lot with this, and that is kind of the relationship between ourselves and the corporate entities out there. It's the relationship between our known self and the self that we present, as well as the sense that people see. And this can be seen on a lot of different songs. The one thing that is interesting, and one that I want to kind of attack right at the beginning, is this kind of trifold aspect of this band in terms of sincerity, because there's a lot of different tracks on here that I feel are very cynical, and not in a good kind of a cynic way, like a cynic in almost like a tongue-in-cheek negative aspect, in like a very destructive way, and not in a this is how we can change society, but more of like, this is how you personally are wrong. And a lot of that is tongue-in-cheek, and that can be found on tracks like Self, like Eminent Sleaze, like Man of the People, especially with Personal Shopper, and a little bit within Followers. A lot of these tracks feel as though the main message behind that is a lot of these problems stem from a society that we live in, and you are a part of the problem. And this can definitely be found on Man of the People, Eminent Sleaze, but specifically with Personal Shopper. And I've already talked a little bit about Personal Shopper when it first dropped, and you can find my whole track review up there. I do feel like within the music presentation on here, it does kind of distance itself from that sincerity of being that almost tongue-in-cheek aspect. It's very electronical, and this whole album does feel like a 80s synth pop take, like something that Depeche Mode, or even more contemporary of Tame Impala or Impala, that kind of style where it's very synth-led, it's very overlaid of synthetic soundscapes to create the sounds that we are hearing. So I do kind of want to drill down a little bit more in specific tracks on here. I mean, the album opens up with Unself, which is basically just an overture. It's just a smattering of different synth sounds that kind of open up the album up, which then leads into Self. And this is where I'm talking about that relationship between the presented self and the actual self. And I don't feel like Steven Wilson's even really addressing the idea or even concept of the actual self, and is much more interested on dissecting and taking a look at the presented self and how that can be shifted based on who's observing the self and who has influence over the self. And who exactly has that influence? Is it the corporates? Is it other people? Is it the media? What does it mean when you are a more well-known media figure, and how does that influence your sense of self? The music that's followed in with that is catchy, it's light, dare I say it's even fluffy at times. Like, it's not complex. Like, nothing on this album is overly complex. Now, that also can't necessarily be said about Ghost King, which feels a little bit more ethereal. It feels a little bit more... I'm thinking, like, it's interesting. This album has been touted a lot as being like the OK computer of the Amazon age by Prog Magazine. No. At least that's not my interpretation. That might be your interpretation, but this feels much more like Amnesiac or even probably Moonshaped Pool, specifically with Ghost King, because it feels much more like a few of the tracks lifted right off of Moonshaped Pool. If we want to compare it to Radiohead, I think Radiohead's a little bit more subtle within their presentation. I think they're a little bit more experimental and a little bit less concerned about making popular music in that sense. I still scratch my head about that comparison. I think they just wanted to pull quote. Ghost King feels much more of like that Tame Impala, like this very synthwave, almost dream pop like, with a number of different overlays of the synthesizers being played over top of one another and really like bleeding us through this really interesting kind of wave of music. And it's interesting because I do feel like Ghost King and Eminent Sleaze are flips of the same coin, in that Ghost King is much more soft, much more ethereal. I feel like Eminent Sleaze is much more tangible. It's bass led. Like Nick Briggs on the bass is still like that meaty chugging bass line. I will admit, whenever I hear this, I can't help but think of Play That Funky Music, White Boy, because that whole dun 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 dun. It's lifted right off of Play That Funky Music, White Boy. But the thing that I'm wondering about is, I know Steven is smart enough to not try to hide his influence. Like, I'm pretty sure this was a conscious choice, because having such a prominent bass line provide this kind of pick up the groove that's lifted practically off of this track, instead of bringing us into this chorus that's very danceable, that's very meaty, that's very uplifting and energetic, the chorus is just kind of a reprisal of the verses. And I'm not all that fan. I'm not a big fan of that. I will admit, this is a very like danceable track in terms of like almost like a striptease or some kind of burlesque show. Like, this would very easily work on a catwalk if somebody's trying to seduce somebody, right? Like that whole and all the clapping on it. It's very like participatory for the audience. Yeah, I mean the actual like lyrical content of this is very like skin deep. Like, it's, you know, you're a sleaze, and especially when it's followed up with Man of the People. And it is interesting in terms of like which tracks are more sincere, because I do feel like Man of the People, 12 Things I Forgot, and I'm going to get to that in a second, as well as Count of Unease, are very sincere, and they almost stick out like a sore thumb sticks out like a sore thumb when you are comparing it to a lot of these very cynical tracks, such as Personal Shopper, Eminent Sleaze, and Self, because those are very cynical. They are very, you know, showing the mirror to society and saying, this is you are bad, feel ashamed. And then you have these very personal songs like 12 Things I Forgot, Man of the People, and Count of Unease that are very Stephen pouring himself out in a very honest and sincere way, and talking about his relationship with this and how it has affected him in a little bit. If you're saying like he's a man of the people, he's a man of this prog sphere, and he's just not connecting, both himself not connecting with the music that's around him, as well as the music that he's putting forth is no longer connecting with his audience, I can understand how he's bashing his head up against that wanting and that need to connect, but having nothing but that disconnect. So it is interesting that both of these concepts are found on a very short album. It's barely over 42 minutes, so it's very interesting in that sense. I do feel like Followers, the 8th track, is probably the weakest track off this album. I'm not feeling it. It's not all that catchy. It's just more of this like hard rock thing. I don't know. I feel like he's done better trying to capture this style of expression on previous works, and it just feels like an afterthought on this one. I do like the concept of having a follower and being an influencer and what that kind of means and begging people to follow, but I don't know. And then we finally come into the closer track of Count of Unease. It's fine. It does a very nice way of closing off the album on more of a sincere take, and I think it's a good choice to close the album off on a sincere note rather than a very cynical note. But again, I'm reminded of Followers in that he's done this style of music better on past albums. And I think that might be my overall thought about this album, even though I immediately connected with it and I immediately enjoyed this album. Everything that's found on this album, he has done in the past and to a better degree. That's not to say that this album's bad, far from it. It's just my own little observation about that. And I do enjoy the fact that Count of Unease is a little bit longer. It's into the 6 minutes, so it allows him to stretch his legs a little bit more and provide a bigger atmosphere to play within. So that leaves me with my favorite track off this album, and the one that I do come back to quite often, which is 12 Things I Forgot. I feel like this single track does exactly what every single track off of To the Bone was attempting to do and failed. This one does it successfully. It is catchy. It is a singer-songwriter. It's very poppy. It's immediately accessible. I immediately grabbed onto it and I loved it. It's reminding me of a lot of the different passages that we found within Lightbulb Sun and in Absentia, and even some of the smaller moments that we had on, say, Deadwing, like Lazarus or Trains, where it's very soft, it's very personal, it's very intimate. Like, I'm feeling more connected with Steven on this track than any other track that he's put out with his solo work. And I think that this is a great successful track in terms of being more of an accessible poppy track, and his attempts at capturing this style of music that up to this point has eluded him. So I really applaud him for 12 Things I Forgot. I just wish that other tracks that were trying this, such as Man of the People and Count of Unease, were able to capture that essence a little bit more instead of fumbling it like a water balloon. And it's interesting. One of the other big concepts of this album, especially on tracks like Man of the People, Eminent Sleaze, Personal Shoppers, Self, is this desire, like the concept of desire and need, and the difference between fulfillment and happiness. Like, you can sell happiness to people, and that is what marketing companies are meant to do. They're trying to create this need, this want of a happiness that you currently don't have, and then saying that you need this product, it will make you happy. And this is particularly found on Personal Shopper. But the thing where 12 Things I Forgot and Count of Unease kind of fill that gap is this idea of fulfillment. You know, you can't buy fulfillment. You can buy happiness. It is fleeting, but you can buy it. You can't buy fulfillment. And that's kind of where this essence of the 12 Things I Forgot really comes into play, is this is where you have that fulfillment. And that's one of the things that, you know, this character of Steven Wilson is coming through and realizing that you can't sell fulfillment. You can't sell satisfaction. You can sell happiness, and that is what we're going to milk the masses for. Because I do think that we have an unhealthy relationship with this pursuit of happiness rather than a pursuit of fulfillment. Because you can be melancholical and sad in a fulfilled environment, and that isn't fleeting. So anyway, that's a little bit of a soapbox moment for me. Oh boy. So in the end, The Future Bites by Steven Wilson was a good time, and honestly, I don't get a lot of the hate that this album is getting that, say, To the Bone was getting. Like, here's the thing, right? Steven Wilson's kind of trapped within a rock and a hard place, right? I will admit that I felt a little betrayed when Steven put out To the Bone. But at the end of the day, that's on me. That's not on him. He's an artist. He can do whatever the hell he wants. And I applaud him for doing that because it's his own expression. Where I felt that betrayal was I was seeing myself reflected in his art, specifically with Raven and Hand Cannot Erase. And when I stopped seeing myself in that, that's where I felt that betrayal. But again, 100%, that is on me. That is not on him. Coming into The Future Bites, I knew what I was kind of expecting, seeing where his art was taking him, and I was more along for the ride. Do I see myself in this? No, I don't. This does not reflect me. It does not reflect my thinking. It's a little too cynical for me. The only parts that I feel connected with are more on those sincere aspects of this album, which are fleeting at best. Coming back to my original point on this of him waiting to release it for a year, I think this album, upon release, is outdated because the world that we see ourselves in is not reflected in the music that he's presenting. Now, that also being said, there is, a massive increase in wealth within those certain individuals, like, the owner of Amazon, and our relationship to have this happiness in this whatever world we find ourselves in 2021. And so there's still a essence of applicability on this album that I do see myself in, even if it is more of an outdated expression. Wow, I've talked a lot about this album. Let's give this an overall rating and some wrap-up final thoughts. I still love this album. I still find myself returning to it. I don't hate this album. I'm reminded of Mr. Burns when he's talking about Marge's portrait of himself. I know what I hate. I don't hate this. I don't find myself grated or angered about this album or outlook. I actually enjoy it. I find it's very catchy. It's very poppy. It's very accessible. I don't think this is going to accumulate the acclaim that he's hoping that it will and reach a massive audience. It's just not going to happen. But I do think that this will sit very nicely on his overall musical expression because, I think it's a fantastic work and I applaud him for it. Honestly, this is one that I would download. And I think that's about where I'm going to leave it. I think that's where I'm going to leave it for the Future Bites by Steven Wilson. What did you guys think about it? I know there's a lot of discourse going on about this album and everything that it has. Let me know about your thoughts, if you loved it, if you hated it, by commenting down below. Let's keep it civil. And if you like what you see and you want to help support me, consider donating to my Patreon. Again, this is the whole Future Bites of you're a shopper, you are biting the hand that feeds you because, I'm for sale and I'm selling myself and you should feel bad for buying me. Anyway, if you want to do that, I've left my Patreon link down below. Jeez, I really need to learn how to sell myself. And that's about it. So thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out. Play that funky music, white boy. Play that funky music, white. Throw down that music and play that proggy music till you die.